Questions et commentaires? Seeing none, resuming debate, the honourable member for Charlottetown.
Mr. Speaker, I'm honoured to speak today on Bill C-36 and to do so on behalf of the Liberal Party of Canada. Today we debate a Conservative bill that purports to comply with the Supreme Court's decision in the Bedford case. Allow me to briefly go over the circumstances that led us here today debating this bill. First, we're here today because a group of courageous sex workers challenged in court and at great expense the laws that govern prostitution, commonly known as the Bedford case. They did so because they wanted to ensure that their work could be done in such a way that protected their security. They fought for safety and security not only for themselves, but for all people involved in the sex industry in Canada. And the Supreme Court of Canada agreed with these women. By way of background, Mr. Speaker, and many Canadians may be unaware of this, but prostitution is currently legal in Canada and has been so since the Criminal Code came into force in 1892. It's the many activities surrounding prostitution which the Criminal Code prohibits, including keeping, using, or transporting a person to a bawdy house, living on the avails of prostitution, or communicating in public for the purposes of engaging in prostitution. That was the state of the law prior to the Bedford case. In December of last year, the Supreme Court struck down those sections related to bawdy house, living on the avails of prostitution, and communicating for the purposes of prostitution. The court ruled that these provisions violated Section 7 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which guarantees the right to life, liberty, and security of the person. The court also indicated that the provisions made it almost impossible to engage in prostitution in a safe environment, as a person selling sex could not legally operate indoors or hire security personnel. It was an historic ruling, Mr. Speaker. The court also provided government with 1 year to legislate, and to do so with the interests of providing a legal framework that protected the safety of sex workers. And this is the government's response. Here is in part what C-36 tells us, and I'm quoting directly from the summary, that the enactment amends the Criminal Code to, among other things, create an offence that prohibits purchasing sexual services or communicating in any place for that purpose, creates an offence that prohibits receiving a material benefit that is derived from the commission of an offence, the offence of purchasing sexual services or communicating in any place. It creates an offence that prohibits the advertisement of sexual services offered for sale, and it authorizes the courts to order the seizure of materials containing such advertisement and their removal from the Internet. It modernizes the offence that prohibits the procurement of persons for the purposes of prostitution, and it creates an offence that prohibits communicating for the purpose of selling sexual services in a public place or in any place that is open to public view that is or is next to a place where persons under the age of 18 can reasonably be expected to be present. And as the Justice Minister said last week in his press conference and yesterday in his speech, the proposed measures criminalize prostitution for the first time since 1892. It criminalizes advertisement of sexual services and criminalizes communicating in public, which is one of the very components of the existing law that the court had already struck down in Bedford. It's hardly surprising, then, that a great many of us in this House and outside of this House are concerned about the approach that the government is taking. By criminalizing almost all aspects of prostitution, the government claims to have struck a made-in-Canada solution, to the so-called Nordic model. Sadly, C-36 has as much or more in common with the prohibitionist approach in force in Albania, Croatia, and Russia. Mr. Speaker, in Russia, brothels are illegal. Under C-36, they will also be illegal in Canada. In Russia, living on the avails of prostitution is illegal. Under C-36, this will also be illegal in Canada. In Russia, buying sex is illegal. Under C-36, this will also be illegal in Canada. In Russia, selling sex is illegal. Under C-36, this will, except for a few narrow exceptions, also be illegal in Canada. Selling sex will be illegal in public. It will be illegal near places where children may be. It will be illegal by underage prostitutes. Mr. Speaker, the differences between the Russian approach and this so-called Made in Canada approach are relatively minor. I wonder, Mr. Speaker, if those present find it somewhat troubling that a country with a record of human rights such as Russia has a regime governing this social problem, this social issue, that is so close to the legislation that is before the House today. Mr. Speaker, the purpose of the Bedford case and the Supreme Court decision was not to pass moral judgment on this activity, but rather to provide a legal framework that would make the environment safe for the women and men involved in the sex industry. And therefore, it is incumbent upon the Conservatives to introduce a law that provides a legal framework that would make sex work safer. Instead, we have a law that will do the opposite. Mr. Speaker, Bill C-36 should be about public safety, and I have concerns that C-36 falls short of that goal. I'm not at all convinced that this bill protects the women and the men who are engaged in sex work. I would also suggest to you, Mr. Speaker, that Bill C-36 in all likelihood violates the Charter with respect to Section 7, life, liberty and security of the person, also with respect to the provisions regarding cruel and unusual punishment, and in respect of the ban on advertising, the Charter protections of free speech. One wonders whether the Conservatives and the Justice Minister know this. Perhaps they know this bill is unconstitutional, and perhaps they know that the bill is not consistent with the Supreme Court ruling in the Bedford case. Mr. Speaker, again, the Conservatives have a duty to comply with the spirit of the Supreme Court ruling in Bedford. I'm not convinced that this is the case, and I doubt that the bill meets the letter or the spirit of the Bedford ruling. The one element of the court ruling that they seem to have complied with was the 1 year provided by the Supreme Court to legislate in this matter. The last couple of times they faced problems with legislation that clearly intersected with the Constitution, the Conservatives did a couple of things. And the two most recent examples, Mr. Speaker, are the Senate reference and the Nadeau appointment. With respect to the Senate reference, the Conservatives realized that there was a potential conflict with the Constitution. They referred the matter to the Supreme Court. With the Nadeau appointment, again, they realized that there was a potential conflict with existing legislation. They took a couple of steps. One, they sought outside opinions with respect to the compliance with the Supreme Court Act. And secondly, they also made a reference or a stated case to the Supreme Court. In addition, there are provisions within the Department of Justice Act, Section 4.1, that come into play here with respect to the constitutionality of the legislation, and undoubtedly the government has an opinion pursuant to Section 4.1 of the Justice Act. There is no doubt that this bill is also headed eventually to the Supreme Court for adjudication on whether or not it complies with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. However, the minister to date has refused to refer the bill to the Supreme Court to ensure its constitutional validity, resorting, as we saw yesterday, instead to personal insults. Nor have the Conservatives given any indication that they will disclose any time soon key evidence to support the bill. Perhaps, Mr. Speaker, this bill is a political stopgap measure to meet the 1 year deadline imposed by the Supreme Court. Perhaps the bill is a politically driven document with an overarching purpose to punt this sensitive and important issue beyond the next election. Refusing a referral to the Supreme Court of Canada is consistent with this view. As I've indicated on many occasions, Conservatives have a track record of introducing legislation for political and partisan reasons, and I hope that is not the case in this instance. I hope it's not the intent of the Conservatives to tee up the fundraising machine on this issue related to the safety of sex workers in Canada in the context of the bill and the court ruling. I hope that the Conservatives will avoid what they have done so often in the past, avoid the temptation to place their own political interests first. I'm also concerned about the lack of transparency as it relates to evidence. Why won't the Minister of Justice produce the evidence to support his assertion that the bill is constitutional? Why won't he waive his privilege and release the Department of Justice documents that prove that Bill C-36 passes the Charter test as is required under Section 4.1 of the Department of Justice Act? Why won't the Minister release any evidence, if he has any, that would support his contention that the bill is Charter compliant? We know that he will not release any Charter compliance documents, but the Minister is also refusing to release anytime soon the $175,000 study his department conducted on this topic. Canadians want to know why the Minister is refusing to release that study, a study paid for by public funds, and one that would have material relevance to the 5-hour debate before this House and material relevance to the committee hearings that are undoubtedly on the horizon. Might we speculate, Mr. Speaker, as to why the Minister would refuse to release that study? Could it be that the study might contain facts or evidence inconvenient to the Conservative position or political interest? As criminal defence lawyer Michael Spratt said in a recent blog about research and the recent cuts made at the Justice Department, he said, and I quote, "It is sometimes said that justice is blind, but justice policy should not be." This is not about politics, quite the opposite. This is about evidence-based policy. It is only when legislation is based on legitimate evidence that there can be any confidence that the law will accomplish their goals. Perhaps the Conservatives are not really concerned with achieving their criminal justice goals, such as keeping the public safe. They have ignored evidence on drug policy, minimum sentences, and child protection, to name a few, resulting in multiple laws being struck down as unconstitutional. End quote. In the lead-up to introducing this bill, though, the Minister was claiming to have all the evidence he needed. Now, what might that evidence be, Mr. Speaker? Well, the Minister seems to be basing his bill in part on an online survey he conducted, a voluntary, non-scientific, online survey that cannot be the basis to construct a bill of such importance, let alone one mandated by the Supreme Court of Canada. We really should be concerned that the government seems to be using a Kijiji approach to public policy. Also noticeably absent from this bill is any measurement mechanism. It is said that you can't manage it if you don't measure it. There are absolutely no provisions in this bill to collect data on the effectiveness of the measures contained in it. Data collection would help inform future amendments and fiscal measures to help the most vulnerable. The concern over this is magnified when we look at the millions of dollars cut out of the Department of Justice budget with respect to research. And the reason given is that all too often the research didn't align with government priorities. Against that backdrop, we have the absence of any data collection measures in this budget. It is in this bill. It is indeed troubling. Mr. Speaker, an email was recently sent to the leader of the Liberal Party from a woman named Rachel. She wanted the opportunity to share her story about the impact this legislation will have on her. She wanted someone to listen to her and to the many others who feel similarly. Here's what she wrote. Bill C-36 horrifies me. It will have a catastrophic effect on my safety and livelihood. I've been an indoor sex worker for 5 years. I screen clients to ensure my safety. This involves asking for a reference from another sex worker and then contacting that worker to ensure the potential client was respectful. If it's the client's first time seeing a sex worker, I require their full legal name, employment information, and cell phone number. I have a conversation via phone or email to discuss what services they are seeking and what I am comfortable providing. I check the client's information against a bad date list, a compilation of bad clients which is shared among sex workers. I also meet new clients in a public place prior to the session, for example, a coffee shop or the lobby of their hotel. Because I am able to screen my clients, I have never experienced violence during my 5 years in sex work. If you criminalize my clients, they will be unwilling to provide the screening information I require to ensure my safety. I will not have any client information to add to a bad date list should something go wrong. If they've seen a sex worker in the past, they will not want to provide that reference because it will mean that they are admitting to committing a crime. I will be forced to accept clients that block their phone number, hide their identity, and have no references. This is a gift to sexual predators posing as clients. Like 90% of sex workers in Canada, I work from an indoor space known as an in-call. If I am assaulted in my workspace due to my inability to screen my clients, I will be unable to contact the police, as this would reveal the address of my in-call location. This means that police can easily arrest my good clients as they come to see me at my safe indoor location. I also risk being evicted by my landlord. Bill C-36 will have an even worse impact on street-based sex workers who also rely on screening their clients to ensure safety. Street-based workers need time to refer to bad date lists, to negotiate safer sex practices such as condom use, and to assess the client. Bad date lists may include the time and date of an incident, a description of the vehicle, a license plate number, and a description of the person, etc. If clients are criminalized and fearful of arrest, they will try to speed up the process, limiting the time a sex worker has to vet their client and refer to a bad date list. Sex workers will be forced to jump into a vehicle with a client without taking these vital safety measures. They will be forced to work in isolated areas away from police, so their fearful clients will continue to see them. Bill C-36 is a gift to predators posing as clients. This bill will not stop sex workers from working. It will just impede their ability to work safely. And Mr. Speaker, her letter closes with, Bill C-36 will kill sex workers if it is passed. Mr. Speaker, history will look poorly on this government for many reasons. The deliberate division, the attack on people who disagree, the politicizing of criminal law, the abuse of power, election fraud, and the list goes on. But I believe what the government is doing here today with this bill is particularly concerning. The government's history of politicizing every issue causes us great concern about what they have done with this bill before the House. Never should the interests of a political party trump the safety of Canadians. Many people believe that Bill C-36 will hurt people, and it will potentially force sex workers into the back alleys without the protection they need. Parliament has a duty to protect Canadians, whether we personally, morally agree with their profession. The Conservatives have a duty to obey the letter and the spirit of the Supreme Court ruling in the Bedford case. On all these counts, the Conservatives have failed and are doing so for political reasons, and for that they will have to live with the consequences should Bill C-36